Welcome to the Messy City Podcast, where we talk with the people who design, plan, build, develop, or even just think about how to create beautiful, successful, and humane cities and towns. Let's learn from each other and create places we truly care about. Welcome back to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. I'm super excited to have this conversation today. My guest is Dr. Seth Kaplan. Seth reached out to me, but also let me know that he's been listening for a while, which is very flattering. So, flattery gets you everywhere, obviously. But no, I mean, in all seriousness, as I've dived into Seth's work, I think I've just been incredibly fascinated by what he's been working on and writing about. And so this is going to be a really cool topic today to get into his thinking and his work about cities and sociability and families and everything. So Seth, thanks so much for joining me today. This is I'm really excited to have you.
Well, first, I'm thrilled to be here, Kevin. And then let me add that I do a lot of podcasts, but I don't do a lot of podcasts that I listen to all the time. So I'm very honored to be on your show.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. And as I was sitting down actually last night making some notes about things to talk about, it very quickly turned into like a mini book.
I want to see your book.
I'm afraid we'll probably just get to a fraction of what I hope to talk about, but that's okay. I think there's so much meat here in your work. I wonder if you could start a little bit by just talking about. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot about place and placemaking and the impact on sociability and relationships and all. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit how you got into this and kind of where you've started from. Because I also know you've written a really good book on the topic as well as numerous articles.
Well, again, if you met me a few years ago, I live right outside of Washington. I live in a wonderful neighborhood. We could talk about that as well. But people would know me as the fragile states person because literally it is my day job to work on different countries. The same way that this podcast might be your night job. And from the emails, it does sound like your night job. This is something like my late afternoon night job as well, because I work on Nigeria, I work on Libya, I work on lots of different countries. But some years ago, 2015, 2016, people started asking me, is the U.S. fragile? And I never thought of working on the U.S., but I took the question seriously when I got asked 6, 7, 8 times, someone sending you a signal when you got asked so many times. And I did what I always do. I did a journey. I had met a lot of people. I visited a lot of places. I deep dive on books. And I think of the frame. When I work on countries, I always start with what is the nature of relationships. I think the health and the future of countries can be determined by looking at how strong or weak their relationships are. And so when I started thinking about what might be wrong with the US, I didn't think about the politics or the economics. I thought about the relationships. And then the key thing I zeroed in on over time, I started just exploring, wandering in lots of directions. But eventually, the question that would come up over and over again is a lot of things are better in America, but something about our relationships are much worse than they used to be. And so the big question was, what has changed over 2 generations and why? And that eventually led me to say that, yes, we have these great national organizations, great companies, great dynamism in our economy, but we've lost in most places, not everywhere, we've lost the local, we've lost the sense of community, we've lost lots of local institutions. And that's where I landed and I wrote this book on fragile neighborhoods, because basically we went from strong neighborhoods to fragile neighborhoods. And that's not just about poverty. You could be in a well-off neighborhood and be isolated and the place is fragile.
Yeah, it's timely in a lot of ways because I sent one of those. There's these little like gifs or gifs, however you say it, that pop up, from time to time that we all share. And there was one that I actually shared with my wife yesterday that tracked the way that people have interact with each other over, say, the last 100 years. And so, like, if you look at the timeline, say, starting in 1920 or 30, the overwhelming amount of time that people spent with each other was family, friends, neighborhoods, right? And, so then it does like this kind of transition and looking at how that changed over the decades. And obviously now it's transitioned to the overwhelming way that people relate to each other is actually online, as opposed to in the physical world. And so I want to talk some about that today, and because you've done a ton of writing about this, and I think it's really interesting if you could just kind of highlight how you think that change has impacted our physical landscape and how we relate to each other.
Well, first, today, when we think of how technology impacts relationships, we think of the phone, the smartphone. But I think it's important to look at this over a longer time horizon and understand that technology, the first technologies that really made a big impact were the car and the TV. And I'm thinking that if you, and again, this is right out of the data, people know Bowling Alone and Robert Putnam's work. Maybe they at least know they've heard of it. He will say that the peak for relationships and the peak for local institutions was 1964, and it's been downhill ever since. And so, what do we see happening in the 50s and then gathering steam in the 60s? We changed the physical landscape around the car. And then we also go from playing outdoors and interacting with their neighbors to basically coming indoors and sitting by ourselves or sitting with a small number of people in front of a screen. And so the phones are exasperating or extending a trend that's already been there for decades. And so we went from what we might call embodied community life, and kids would have play based life, and then we incrementally disconnected from each other, incrementally distrusted each other more and more, incrementally withdrew into ourselves, became more individualistic, and the phones are the latest version of that. And I think there's so many good things that we've got from the dynamism that this has released. We've gone from place based life to network based life. We've become more meritocratic. We've given opportunity to parts of our society that didn't have it before. So there's so many good things about that, but we don't really appreciate what we've lost. When you live in a place with lots of local institutions, small businesses, civic associations, churches, local schools, you have all this overlapping relationships and networks, and you basically live in what you might call I live in one of these neighborhoods. You live in a security blanket, and you feel a sense of joy around you. You feel a sense of agency that I can actually go out and I can be on the board of something, or I can volunteer for something. There's an abundance of activities. There's abundance of relationships. There's abundance of things you can just do, and you feel important. I mean, my kids, they go out, they go away. I say, call me after night time comes. I'll pick you up. I don't worry about it. Or my wife has to go and take care of her mother because she's ill and I need help with carpools or something. And I have four different neighbors, 2 mornings and 2 evenings. Or you can go on and on and on about the hundreds of examples of what people just are there for each other. And I think most Americans have lost that. I think most Americans are, I would say, less optimistic. They feel more disconnected, lonely. They feel more of a lack of agency. They have their apps, but they don't have someone to talk to. They don't have these relationships that organically develop. And I just think it affects us in so many ways, and we don't actually realize it. And I think it affects the whole mood of the country, actually.
So there's a lot of what you describe about the neighborhood you live in, and I do want to talk more about that as we go through it. But I think there's probably there's a lot of Americans who have almost like a vestigial memory of what you're talking about. If you're old enough, you may remember a community that was like that, or maybe you heard parents or grandparents talking about a neighborhood that was like that when they grew up. And I wonder if you could just trace a little bit more of, you know, what exactly changed and how it impacted those neighborhoods. You know, one of the things that we think about all the time. So we happen to have a nice neighborhood where we have a bunch of neighbors that have kids that are all about the same age, and so we've got a really nice, almost like a Goldilocks situation with that. But it's also just very tiny. You know, it's super tiny as compared to like what when you write about your neighborhood and your experiences. We have a little bubble, but that bubble is easily pierced by going a block away, right? Um, or certainly 2 or 3 blocks away. But that's not historically the case that a lot of people remember in the neighborhoods that were common, say 100 years ago. I wonder if you could talk more about that change.
So let me give you two answers. First, let me describe what a real neighborhood community is, and let me answer about the change. So, you, first of all, you're so fortunate, and I would just grab onto that magic you have and realize how precious it is, and also how unusual it is. And I would also urge people listening or watching this to say, ask yourselves, what can you do to get a bit of that magic? And that may mean reaching out to neighbors. That may be, and we could talk about what that is. But in my neighborhood, so for example, I'll give some examples. My daughter, about my oldest is 12 years old. Roughly 3/4 of her classmates are walking distance from our house. She knows exactly where they live. She can walk to any of those houses, probably the farthest of those 3/4 of her. There's a couple that are some neighborhoods away that are not immediate, but she can walk maybe 20-25 minutes, knows how to get there. Sometimes she goes with a friend and they go house to house, they go house hopping or whatever you want to call it. When I walk out, it's not about friendships where I live, it's about relationships. I literally know, and my wife would know more than me because I tend to live in a cave a little bit, thinking like in my basement office. But she literally, there's hundreds of people that I can say hi to that I recognize. We walk street after street after street, and I do this in my morning walk. And I know maybe not every house after I get a few blocks away, but I could point to, oh, there's a lawyer in here, there's a doctor in here, this guy does so and so, this guy is messy in his house, and you know something about all these people. And the key thing is, they're not my friends, they're my relationships. And we have a sense of community and togetherness. And I've probably been in, I don't know, 40 or 50 different houses in my neighborhood, if you can imagine that. And I would be considered among the less
Hmm.
socially active people because we have meals, we have gatherings, or whatever it is, or we go over, we have WhatsApp groups for items. I don't need this anymore. Do you want this? And I'm going over there and I'm chatting for 10, 15 minutes and I'm picking them up. Or we have a few restaurants and I go in and say hi to you and hi to you. And then we see them on the street. The key thing is there's a density of relationships and there's a density of place unique institutions that we all do something with, and it's a cascading effect. So this is where I am now. What has changed now? First, the most obvious thing that has changed, I think, for your audience is the physical landscape has changed. Now, I live in a suburb. We all have houses, but they're not very far apart. We don't quite have walkable streets, but there's no cars, so it doesn't really matter. Some sidewalks, some no sidewalks, but the traffic is mostly around the neighborhood, not really through the neighborhood. So you can walk everywhere. But I would say many people, and we have a center and we have an identity. My neighborhood, Kent Mill, Silver Spring, Maryland. This Kent Mill describes a specific place. There's a specific center. There's specific institutions that belong in the neighborhood. Many people, they're physically farther apart. They live in what we might call a placeless location, that there's no center, there's no identity. If I go 10 minutes from here, nice houses, but where does it begin? Where does it end? Is there a neighborhood school? Is there a neighborhood church? Is there a neighborhood shop? Is there a neighborhood civic association? None. We have all those things. I think partly by accident, partly because we were built in the early 60s, probably at the right when things were beginning to change, but they hadn't changed too much. Things that are built afterwards, the physical landscape disconnects. There's no local institutions. So I would say, what are the changes? Well, change one is the physical landscape has changed dramatically. Second of all, the places where we used to meet and participate, they're either not there or they're significantly decayed. If you pray, if you go to a church, I mean, I go to synagogues. We walk to our synagogues. If I have a lot of friends that go to churches, there's a couple of churches right near me, and I know people go to those churches. They don't actually live here. They drive to the church and they drive their kids to the schools, and they're not in the same place. And the different people, and they become functional networks. They don't become community building blocks, which is the big difference between what we used to have. Used to have all these institutions, all this gathering was local, but if your school is driving to, if your shops you're driving to, or you're doing it virtually, if your church you're driving to, if everything is a different car ride away, what brings people together? So I would say the dramatic change is the physical plus the economic, civic, all these associational life has either been nationalized or scaled up, and then we end up with a vacuum, a bunch of houses, and that is all.
Yeah, it's fascinating. There's just so much here that I want to talk about, but there's
I mean, if you're in a small town, you might be fortunate that you still
right,
have what we used to have, but
right,
those are the exceptions.
yeah, and it's almost a certain size small town because you can that can escalate beyond
Yes.
that scale pretty quickly. It's funny, you talk about the physical landscape and how you define your neighborhood with like a center and an edge, and there's like a school. And it reminds me of the famous Clarence Perry diagram from 1929, which was really kind of at the dawn of the city planning movement as an administrative
Yes.
movement in America. Clarence Perry worked on the regional plan of New York, and he produced this idyllic sort of neighborhood plan, which was going to be the planning unit. And that happened to be produced at basically at the end of the era where we started building those actual neighborhoods like that. And what we've built since then really went the other direction until the new urbanists started kind of reviving the art of actually building neighborhoods, or talking about building neighborhoods anyway. I do want to read. I want to read something you wrote back to you, because I thought this is interesting, and it builds on what you were just talking about in terms of community and building community. So this is in one of the articles you wrote that you said community is produced when members of any city, neighborhood, or marriage are committed to the relationship, invest in it, and stay devoted during tough times. Such commitment, especially from leaders, is essential to maintaining the strength of that city, neighborhood, or marriage when alternative opportunities present themselves or particularly difficult conditions appear. Wonder if you could expand on that just a little bit.
So, one of my favorite words is stewardship, stewarding a place. And I think when you have a sense of place, a sense of belonging, a sense that this place is your home and that this place matters, your attitude towards it is so different than what is the norm today. Today, we tend to be transactional. We tend to focus on the material, and we're transactional, and we look at problems and we look for a material solution. We look at simple example. We look at schools and we focus on the vocational. We don't focus on the relational aspect of schools. But you could go on and on and on. Where we shop, we think of the fastest way to get my food instead of the relationship I might have in a place or with the people who run a place, and so on and so forth. So I think what I'm saying there, most importantly, is this importance of stewardship is most obvious when a place is under strain. When you have neighbors, and I'm going to give an example from my neighborhood. I'm going to give a few. I'm going to give a few examples. I live at 910 on a 2 block street. There's this incredible woman at 90. I think it's 903, and I don't think anyone notices her. She doesn't talk a lot. She's a bit quiet. We have a lot of people in my neighborhood who are real stewards, real leaders. that would not be the case anywhere else, simply because people are committed to the place and they do things. So she's not a big leader, but I'm aware that she goes around and visits people who live alone, because I know her mother lives alone in the neighborhood. We have a lot of families with many houses in my neighborhood, and her mother lives a few blocks away. And my immediate neighbor on this other side lives alone, and she must be in her 80s. And this woman visits her. I know when we have a cleanup at the park, she's the one organizing the cleanup. I know if there's a volunteer activity to donate clothes or an activity for a nonprofit, it's her house that we drop things off, or if there's an email. So this person is doing stuff over and over and over again. I mean, that would be one example. But I could give you so many other examples. I'm thinking of, for example, I'm on a WhatsApp group, and I was traveling end of last year, and it came up. The WhatsApp group is, I'm on so many. I must have 10 different WhatsApp groups for my neighborhood, and one of them came up that there was a child missing, and before you knew it, this quiet WhatsApp group became alive with people, and before you know it, they'd set up a spin-off WhatsApp group, and maybe 25 people joined it. And before you know it, like, this is within 90 minutes, they were organized and they were going off in four different directions looking for this child. And within another 90 minutes, the child was found. They wanted to do it before it was dark. So somehow, within roughly 3 hours, people had self-organized, and there was no leader, actually. It was self-organized to solve problems. There were no public authorities, no police involved. And then the WhatsApp group was, well, I went through the forest because we're surrounded by forests on a couple of sides, or something like forest. I need help getting home, and people were going around driving people home. And it was just an episode out of the blue. But I could go on and on and on with just the multitudes, and I mean multitudes of people who just, I'm thinking of the dentist 2 houses from me, very quiet guy. I don't think of him as I don't want him to hear me say that he's a very normal. He's like my idea of a normal person, and yet I have him leading some initiative for the neighborhood, and I have him fundraising, or his wife is fundraising for some other organization in the neighborhood, and it just amazes me when people feel a sense of place and they're committed to the place. They're stepping up in hundreds of little ways, and I'll just give one more example. I mean, my neighborhood is not without tragedy. We do have tragedy. We do have sad stories. People do spend a lot of time. I mean, we hear about sadness. We hear about tragedy. I have another neighbor who unfortunately has a daughter and son in law who both died before they were 30,
Hmm.
and they had two kids.
Hmm.
And those grandparents are now in charge of the kids, but they have a whole community there helping them. He happens to have, there's one of the siblings of those grandparents live in the neighborhood. They belong to a synagogue, they belong to school. And so there's all these different institutions that actually come together, and people. So, I mean, you can't remove the tremendous responsibility they have for those kids, but a lot of things are made easy because you're not solving crisis alone. And I would just say, one of the stark things when you wander around our country, and I like to wander and observe and talk to people, is a lot of us have crises, and we don't realize how much harder those crises are because we're alone,
Yeah.
and because we don't want to be vulnerable, and because we don't have the relationships. And when you have all that, so many things are easier to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah. It's well said. So one of the things, Seth, obviously, is that your neighborhood is really oriented around a specific faith, right? It's mostly Orthodox Jewish neighborhood and community, um, which 100 years ago would have been extraordinarily common in the United States. I mean, people tend to forget this now, but really, especially our urban neighborhoods were just differentiated by ethnic groups for the most part, and organized often around a church or a faith or a religion, and people walked to the neighborhood church and went to the neighborhood school, and there was sort of a commonality of even faith among the people who lived in a place, and much of that has been obliterated. So, kind of what you're experiencing now is more unique. How important, how critical is that? Do you think that element to the success or of what you're describing?
Well, I would say, when I've seen in the United States, I've seen four ways that you get what I experience. So religion is definitely one. And it's not only my faith. You could find places with a strong sense of where there's a critical mass of religious people that go to a local church. Again, it's not always immediately walking, but the fact is they're close enough to each other that they have something like the old parish system where people were living nearby. And so I've seen religion. I've seen some parts of the country where it's cultural. I think you could see in towns, smaller towns, there's simply this culture of community and caring for the place. I think that's particularly obvious in the Midwest of the United States. To a certain extent, the South, I see it a bit less on the coast. Something about those parts of the country where there's a real culture and a lot of places that they care about the place and they want to step up for their place. So there's religion, there's culture. I've seen it where when you're in a location that's somewhat physically cut off. I mean, I know someone who in Connecticut they moved to a place they thought just for a year, but because it was somehow removed by the something to do with the way the town was set up, and they had a couple of local shops, and they were surrounded like a small lake. That something about everybody in that immediate neighborhood had a really strong sense of community. They moved there for a year, and they're there like 10 years later. They did not want to give it up, and they were so. And I've also seen it when you're in a place with simply lots of local institutions. And that would tend to be a more well off place, the last of those four. You can go to like Park Slope in Brooklyn. You can go to Chevy Chase near here. And these are neighborhoods with lots and lots of local institutions, and those things are incredibly socially dynamic, and there's a lot of social interaction. So I would say there's a social, a cultural, a religious, and a physical way you create this. And mine is one. We have a little bit of being cut off from the other, but I do think there's other ways to produce this. I think the unfortunate thing is probably only about 1/4 or 1/5 of American neighborhoods have this, and this is why I call for us to be much more intentional about thinking of the physical landscape and the way we think about the way we organize life. So this would be the norm for many, many more people.
I want to read something else. I found a number of excerpts that I thought were really really good. I was hoping I could use today as in our discussion, and I thought this one also was interesting and kind of builds upon what you're talking about. But um, this one goes: the neighborhoods that people inhabit are far less politically and socioeconomically diverse than they used to be. Richard Reeves describes how dwindling participation in the community organizations that used to bridge social gaps means that Americans tend more and more to interact exclusively with people who are like themselves. This silo effect is widespread, but the social chasm has grown particularly large between the upper middle class and everyone else. And I think what you're describing about your neighborhood is sort of the opposite of that, where you really have this physical mixing of lots of different kinds of people. I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on this thought and just um, how people have sort of divided themselves along different lines today.
Yes, if you go back in American history, the stark divisions in neighborhoods was racial. We had segregation. So there was the black neighborhood and then there was the white neighborhood. And you can see the legacy in many urban areas, for example, of that today. But I would say what we didn't have was the political the homogeneity by class and by politics. We were in politically diverse or viewpoint diverse, and we were in class diverse neighborhoods. So my neighborhood, again, some of this is accidental, but again, besides the fact that it's a more natural neighborhood and now it's brought together, we have a broad range of houses. So you could live in this neighborhood and live in an apartment. You could live in this neighborhood and live in a somewhat cheap house. You could live in this neighborhood and live in a $2 million house. And again, there's slightly different parts of the neighborhood, but they're all walking distance and within the neighborhood. And that was the norm, the way things used to be. Now, if one of the stark things, and again, I've been in lots of countries, so I would say there's a few things that are very stark about the American physical landscape. One of them is how class based the neighborhoods have become. I do think it's less visible that they are politically much less diverse than they used to be. You can see that on a map after an election. But what's so stark is you go to some neighborhoods and every house is a very nice house. And of course, we all know, I mean, your listeners will know that those have been zoned to exclude less affordable, I mean, cheaper housing.
Mhm.
And so that the housing crisis is partly the choices that people have made to exclude other classes from their neighborhoods. On the other hand, you can go to lots of neighborhoods and that there's empty lots, there's dilapidated housing. And I'll just give a very and the implications for this for our society are great, but the implications are also great if you're a manager of a city or if you're thinking about the future of the country. Atlanta is a city I know somewhat much about. Atlanta has had a growing population for several decades. And at some point, I've done an analysis. It's not in this book, but it's in something that will be published. And the city grew by 75,000, I don't know, over 10 years. But if you look at the map, in about half the city, maybe 60% of the city, the population grew by 125,000, which meant rising housing prices, hard for people to find places to live. And another 40% of the city, there was a drop in 50,000 people. And what you do is if you drive around Atlanta, you got some incredibly nice neighborhoods, and yet you have significant chunks of the city that nobody wants to live in. And so there's this gap in terms of the life trajectories based upon where you live, even the health or based on statistics could be 15 or 20 years different. But there's also think of the wealth accumulation, and a lot of that's racial. And so, but you also think about Americans more broadly. How are we experiencing life? We're experiencing life so differently just based upon where we live, because some of us live in really nice neighborhoods and some of us live in really not so nice neighborhoods. And that's a product of many choices. I think originally there was the racial element, but there's been a lot of choices since that I would not blame on the racial element, but has created a highly class-based society.
Yeah, and you've written about how that kind of class differential is especially noticeable within what we might call elite society, and the different attitudes now that, and I look, I might include myself in that term in elite society. You know, I'm a professional and I'm an architect. I live in an urban area in a nice neighborhood, um, and but the different attitude that like sort of societal elites might have today versus how they used to have as a consequence of more
Yes.
physical clustering together.
So one of the when you don't live with other people, I mean, you have much less of an inclination to care about them, to know them. We talked before about stewardship. So I think a society in which people do not steward place is a much more, I don't know how would I say it, it's going to be eventually a much poorer society. I don't mean economically, but a much more divided society, a society which people care much less for each other, a society with a lot more alienation for his society. So that lack of stewardship, the example is being set. I mean, yes, I'm also an elite. I have a PhD, I have a professional career, and so on and so forth. But I would say that when people don't steward place and they live apart, so they could steward their neighborhood and they could send their nice checks to these fancy nonprofits who are doing great work, and they could basically on a personal level have no need to care or to roll up their sleeves or to even interrelate or have a relationship with people from different parts of society. You're really creating a society that by definition is going to be unfair, a society that by definition is going to leave a lot of people behind. Places thrive because we care about places. Places don't thrive because you sent a check to a nonprofit. The nonprofit gave somebody food or helped them pay their rental check this week. Or and so when we live apart, we lose we basically are throwing away. I mean, again, we all want to live in a nice neighborhood. I'm not telling you to get up and move, but we're basically showing a great disregard for our fellow citizens, and we are basically losing the chance to really steward our society such that we all are benefiting from it.
Yeah, that kind of really struck me in one of the things that you wrote, where you talked about, this urge that we all, well, we all, but that has certainly changed over time in terms of our charity and our giving. And so instead of having a place based approach to giving, that you might help a group in the neighborhood, help a nonprofit in the neighborhood that was doing work in your area, in your community. Now we just devolve to, we give to issues and campaigns that could be national or
Yes, yes.
international, that are very impersonal. But they, I guess they make us. It fits a need that to make us feel good in some way, but it's not really impacting necessarily the place we live.
Yes, I would say, I mean, those are good. They can be good causes, they can help people. But I would say our lives will be socially richer if we actually cared about a real place and real people, and we work with others to make the place better. And it's in some ways it's harder work because you have to go and you have to talk to people and you have to show up for a meeting, or you have to show up and do things on a interpersonal. I mean, it's hard work. Writing a check and saying I did great things is far easier than actually showing up and doing something. But I would say that um, real helping people is actually the personal. It's not the material, but just by sending a check. And I would say we personally lose something. There's an example in my book, Thread, if I may make this more practical, from Baltimore. So Thread was started by a student at Johns Hopkins University, Sarah Heminger, wonderful woman. She was in school, and the real trigger was that she felt extremely lonely in her program at Johns Hopkins, her graduate program. She was studying something with neurology. She's really quite brilliant. And she just felt that this was intellectually stimulating, and she felt tremendously lonely. And she had her husband had this experience when he was growing up, and she knew this experience, that he had basically lost his family, and he was supported basically by four teachers to help get through high school. So she just started by reaching out to a school nearby, a school with kids that were not doing very well, that also did not have such strong family support. And what she did was she started this organization, getting lots and lots of people to help in groups of 4 or 6, to help individual ninth graders, to give them 24/7 support and love, and help them thrive in a way they weren't thriving. These were kids that had like a zero point 0.7 GPA, that were the worst performing kids in a city in which does not have a very good education system. And they were able, but the point of this is they were able to transform those kids, but it became a two-way street, because yes, they were making themselves available, and yes, they were transforming lives through the relationships, not so much by giving them this or giving them that, is because the kids didn't have the sense of security, didn't have the sense of love, didn't have the sense that someone was there 24/7. But what the benefit to the volunteers was that their lives became much more socially rich, and it becomes like an equal relationship over time, and it's literally transformative. And I just think when you give interpersonally and you give of yourself, and I mean, some of my best relationships in my neighborhood are because I'm involved in one nonprofit for many years, and I sit on the board. I mean, I do other things, but that's my personal investment. And those are people I know well, and I visit their homes and I talk to them, and it's a completely different relationship. And it's just giving a check and feeling good, and protesting national causes in which we have a much less of an impact on, I think, is much less rewarding, and it's not stewardship. And to me, it's actually a lesser form of citizenship. Real citizenship starts at home.
So, I mean, one of the things that really fascinates me about all this is that there's sort of this desire, um, and we do this a lot on the podcast to talk about like technical solutions. We get into like the technical aspects of how you build a community, and well, we need to fix this zoning law, or we need to fix this process, or here's how you build a building, or something like this. But there's this other aspect which is very very human, which is about culture that you are talking a lot about, and it's the interactions and the interplay among the actual people themselves that matter as much, if not more, than sort of the technical world that we construct for ourselves.
Yes, I would say if there's a big lesson I learned, I mentioned before the lesson about relationships in countries, and I'm going to apply this to neighborhoods. Countries that have strong social cohesion end up with strong institutions. And if you have the relationships and the institutions, you can somehow solve the problem of money or resources or education. You have ways to solve problems. On the other hand, if you don't have that cohesion, you don't have those institutions, people can give you lots of money, and odds are you will not solve many problems. I think Jane Jacobs has a
Mm-hmm.
quote someplace in which you talk about neighborhoods that work are very able, this is not a direct quote, are able to solve problems. Neighborhoods that don't work are they're frustrated by the littlest problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so I listened to this podcast many times, and you've had some actually really good examples of people like in small towns. I forget the example not many weeks ago about a small town in I think it was in Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
People come together, and the key was that local business people felt a sense of responsibility to place, and local community members came together to organize. And that's exactly what I'm talking about here. But I'm talking about the need for us to, as a society, build the landscape, build the institutions, and cultivate this sense of we are together. We need to solve our problems together in every place. And I think this is so much lacking, and it simply affects the choices we make. It affects the choices our leaders make. It affects our political, civic, social, and we're not working together. And if we're not practicing it locally, believe me, we're not going to do a good job nationally either, because it all starts with practice, and the practice must start locally.
Yeah, so I think the conversation you were referencing was with Jared Wheeler, who I talked to in Iola, Kansas, and we talked about uh, the way he put it. Towns are either bitterness factories or hope
Yes, I
factories.
love that.
Uh,
So I live in a hope factory,
yeah,
and I know there's a lot of neighbors that are bitter factories. So
yeah,
that was a great quote. Actually, I need to use that quote
yeah. I
someplace.
thought I thought he really nailed it. And I'm curious what you thought about like one of the theses that we talked about in that conversation is um, there's been such a change uh, uh, about especially the impact of like local business people in communities all over the country. So, we talked about it in the relevance to small towns, but I see this in large metropolitan areas as well, where the department stores, the banks, the insurance companies, they all used to be owned locally. They were local business people
Yes,
and entrepreneurs. And now what you see is there's some of that, but there's much more of it that they are like branches of large
yes,
corporations. And uh, I mean, I think it's obvious to see how that's had a really negative impact on civic life, because you're just less bought into a place when you are, say, like a middle manager or an executive vice president of a large company versus the owner of it. I wonder, do you think that holds water? Do you see any of that in your work?
Well, first of all, to be honest, the book I'm working on next is going to talk about that exact issue. So
Oh,
I'm
cool.
totally bought into that idea. So I would say we've gone from a society with local stewardship to a society with lots of big systems. That's big finance systems, big business systems, big. I mean, I even think civil society has become a lot of big systems. Government has become much more a big system. Even you could say going from small churches to mega churches, religion has become more of these big systems. And so I think, besides the fact that it means that a lot of these institutions, they don't work well except when they're scale, And I think it's good for our country that we do have great large systems, but we've lost the balance. And a healthy society needs the right balance between big and small. And the balance just shifted too far towards the big. And I think we need to be intentional. We have too much big finance, not enough small finance. We have too much. You could even think of big healthcare, not enough small healthcare, and you could go on and on. So we have big businesses. Any location, whether it's a neighborhood, a town, a county, a smaller city, they for them to thrive, they need their own business people who care. When I look at the Midwest, I look at, for example, Grand Rapids has a lot of local money, and those people care enough that they're continuously reinvesting in the city. As an example, but you could go to another. I'm not going to mention because maybe I don't know all the choices, but you can see there's places in which there's local business people and foundations that continue to invest. I'm thinking of Pittsburgh, another
Mm-hmm.
example.
Mm-hmm.
Pittsburgh
Sure.
had enough local money and enough people that cared that they helped turn around the city. And Grand Rapids, you see continuous investment in the local to keep the city going. And it's one of the few places in that part of the country with population growth.
Yeah.
And so I think what we see everywhere is when you have local businesses, you have local philanthropies, you have local leaders, you have people who care. And what every place needs to do, it needs to nurture. It needs to not only, some places can attract and you need to retain, but you also need to nurture. And part of that is, what does it mean in terms of small investments? What does that mean in terms of incubation? What does that mean that current leaders are helping raise the next set of leaders? Those could be economic leaders, they could be civic leaders, social leaders, but we need to constantly think that the long-term thriving of our place is we're able to retain, we're able to attract, we're able to incubate these institutions, economic and other, that will help our places thrive. And to the extent that our country, to be honest, today works in a way that works against the small places, whether it's neighborhoods or towns or counties, it's actually harder. There's some headwinds, but it doesn't mean that we can't do it. And we can certainly find good examples of success. We just need to find ways to replicate those successes in many more places.
Yeah. I look forward to that book. That sounds fantastic. So Seth, the Midwestern practical person in me has to also then turn and ask a little bit about talk to people about what they can do. So they listen to this, they think, this really resonates. God, I wish I lived in Seth's neighborhood. That sounds amazing. I certainly, I think that sounds great. God, I wish I could turn my kids
Please
loose.
come and visit, Kevin. I'm waiting for your visit.
I will have it on the list. That sounds wonderful. I'm sure my kids would love it. So what can people do? What are some of the takeaways that you've come up with over the years to say, here's things that people can do in their own neighborhood or community, that are just on a level that are more practical that they can take forward?
So I'm going to first answer that question for individuals, and then we could think about other like local institutions. So I generally think at an individual level, there's three things you can do. One is to do something like what people in your little bubble have already done, is that they specifically look around their house. I don't know, maybe the 8 houses nearby or their block. Who do you know? How can you get to know people on your block? Does that mean knocking on a door? Does that mean walking over when someone's coming outside with the car? Whatever it is, can you organize something that's very, very local? Try not to be too ambitious. Start very simple. That would be one thing. Second thing is find somebody, may not be in your immediate block, but somebody nearby you can partner with. Try to find a couple of people you partner with and be a little bit more ambitious. Can we have a block party? Can we organize some sort of neighborhood gathering? I mean, my neighborhood is exceptional. We had this incredible event in September. One of the neighbors, I think it was a birthday present to himself, to be honest, but he brought together some great musicians that had some connection to the neighborhood. He got a couple of other neighbors to let him use their backyards. and we had like hundreds of people at a neighborhood concert,
Hmm.
literally in the backyard for hours with this music. It was like the greatest event I have ever seen. I mean, literally, he made a lot of effort, didn't ask for any money. I mean, whatever he did, it was incredible. And so I would just say, but the second thing is find a few neighbors and organize some activities. The third thing you could do is find some local institutions. Could be a nonprofit, could be a business, something, and could be a local school. Find a way to partner with an institution and make something that would be more regular, that would bring people together, whether it's for the kids, whether it's for the neighbors. So I would think those are not too hard. Anyone can do. What I would also say is if you have a small business, I mean, my neighborhood is fortunate that we have a bunch of people who literally run businesses, air duct business, plumbing business, like small businesses out of their homes. I think the guy across the street runs a toy store. So whatever, the businesses are not necessarily in the neighborhood, but they run these businesses as, I mean, how do we get small businesses to care about a neighborhood? Certainly the restaurants care. Can the local library care? Can the local school care? Can the local church care? If you're working one of these organizations, I'd be asking yourself, how do you be more neighborhood facing? How do you not just think of your mission in the walls of the restaurant, of the church, of the school, of the library? How do you get out there and have more of a relationship with your neighborhood, such that you are that I think it's actually good for business, but it's also a way for you to contribute through your neighborhood to building relationships. And I think those institution leaders, whatever form it may be, they have an incredibly important role to play, especially as stewards of place.
What I think is fascinating about so much of that is, especially in the strong towns world, but also in presentations that I've given over the years, a lot of the things like the takeaways that we might give to people, like they're like there's a whole host of small things that people can do to improve their neighborhood that doesn't involve like it needs a massive like redevelopment or something.
Yes.
There are just so many low hanging fruit, so to speak, that plant. You can get together with your neighborhoods and plant trees, plant flowers, do cleanup days. You can do all sorts of things to help your local business. You can help paint a crosswalk, or
So true.
there are all these things that are really very, very local that people can do on their own that work to kind of the same effect, the melding of sort of the community aspect and the physical.
I mean, again, I you can be ambitious, but I would never start very ambitious. I would start very incremental. This is very strong towns.
Yeah.
Identify a problem and look for an incremental way to improve it. I can think of my neighborhood. I mean, we happen to have this small commercial corridor, not beautiful, but we do have that center. It's really important for our neighborhood. And there's a street you have to pass with a bit of traffic and a light, and neighbors didn't like the light. So they literally petitioned for the way the signal worked to be changed so it would be more cross pedestrian friendly. And that would be like the littlest thing you can imagine, but I know it helps because it's easy.
Mhm.
It's easier to cross. My kids are easier to cross, and that's like one thing. I can think of stop signs. I can think of tree planting. I can think of somebody petitioned and now they made a easier to cross over here with some sort of path in this on marked on the street. So again, you can just think that somehow they petitioned and they're building a small bridge over a little creek we have in our neighborhood. There's hundreds of things. Most of them, they don't cost a lot of money. You have to engage the government. You have to engage your neighbors. And I would say start small, but think about collaboration and the nature of improving your place is actually the easiest way to build the relationships. You don't make relationships by seeking to make relationships. You make relationships by working together to make your place better in whatever form that might be. And the product of that is a richer community in terms of socially rich community, but that's not your goal. Your goal is a practical goal And I mean, that's very much strong towns. Strong towns, you build community by trying to make your place better. And I completely agree with that approach. And that is exactly what I would argue for.
Well, that's really well said, and that I feel like that's a great place to stop for now. Um, so, if people want to seek you out and find your work, what do you suggest is the best place to go?
Well, first of all, I welcome any and all people who want to find me. Happy to talk to you more. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Seth Kaplan. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me. I do have a website basically about the book, Fragile Neighborhood, sethkaplan.org. You can always email me, Seth at my first name at sethkaplan.org. But why don't you start with LinkedIn? And I look forward to hearing from people.
All right. Well, Seth, thanks so much. This was really interesting. I love your work. I really look forward to the next book, and we'll have to come back and do this again when that comes out.
And I look forward so much to hearing more of your podcast because I love the podcast. And I would just tell people get your friends to listen. There's a lot of great value in this
I
podcast.
appreciate that. That's very kind of you. All right. Seth Kaplan. Thanks very much. Take care.
Take care.